Hi, Richard. How you doing? Thanks for joining me once again on Pari Pursue. How have you been?
I'm good, Ola. It's good to be with you again. Thank you.
Yeah, same here. Good to see you again. The topic that I'm talking to you about today is a topic that is very sensitive to me. I really appreciate you joining me to talk about this. And, there's been a whole lot about, Black people lately. I also jokingly say that it's a good time to be Black. And I say that, maybe after the Black Lives Matter theme goes by, maybe we'll start African Lives Matter, because that's a whole different ball game entirely that has not been scratched. I'm really looking forward to getting your views, especially with regards to African lives, African news, and the media. But before we dive right into it, I want to ask you a strange question. What's your most interesting day in the newsroom?
There was one day when I was a junior in the newsroom and I was on the phone to a representative in another part of Canada. And at the same moment I said, "Oh, our power's gone out." The power went out. And he said, "So is ours." I said, "Stand by." So I started calling all different areas around him and discovered that the entire power grid had gone down for a whole region of Canada, all of Quebec and a good part of Ontario. And we got the news story before anybody else because I realized very quickly, if his power's out and he was 300 kilometers away and our power went out at the same moment, maybe there's something bigger going on here. And we ended up breaking the story that the power had gone out throughout the entire grid. We were the ones that got the story. It was a good day, a very good day. Not a great day for people losing power.
Yeah.
It was a good day to get the scoop in the newsroom.
Yeah. How about a bad day? Any bad day?
A really bad day is when it's very, very, very quiet. And I remember going into the office on a Sunday and we were literally hoping something awful would happen because we had nothing to cover. There was really virtually no news. It's a very quiet time. But there really is no such thing as no news. It's who you depend upon to gather it for you, which we're probably going to talk about in a few minutes. But worst day is when there's nothing going on and there's guys walking around going, "Wish there was a hijacking or something." But the worst day is when there's just nothing, appears to be nothing happening, and you feel like you're trying to invent news.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I had a bad moment in the newsroom also when I was back at home in Nigeria covering the legislative arm, the lower house, the House of Representatives. And I remember when I joined that team, there was a pool of reporters that I met there, and they had this association, within the National Assembly quarters where, they just form a quorum of journalists. And for some reason, they just decided that they didn't like my face and I would never be part of it. I had my accreditation anyway, so I could go in and do the news whenever I wanted to, but they didn't allow me to be part of the association,
It doesn't matter where you go in life. Someone is waiting to
someone is making to point fingers at you. If you look different, if you dress different, if you talk different, it's everywhere. I also always tell people that this is sensitive, but it's my view that sometimes I feel sometimes it's beyond racism. Sometimes I know there's racism, but sometimes it's about good and bad people.
Well, in my career, and I think a lot of the viewers would appreciate this. When I was a younger man, there was always an older man trying to trip me up, and we're not going to let this guy get ahead. We're going to slow him down. There's a lot of that too.
Yeah.
Like professional jealousy. And I can't tell you. So I decided when I got in that position, when I saw somebody young coming up, I was going to help them out. I got nothing to lose. But I got to tell you, there's a lot of older guys along the way a lot of women have run into this, I'm sure. That a lot of older guys would make your life difficult. Yeah.
Yeah, at this point, I'd like to say publicly, thank you, Richard, for being who you are and helping every one of us, no matter the color, no matter who we are, to achieve our goals here in Canada. Thank you so much, Richard. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, Richard, let's dive right into it. So, on a good day, if you're on the desk in a newsroom somewhere in North America, what will you be looking out for in a bulletin? Your reporters are coming in with stories. What are the things you're looking out for?
Well, part of what happens is some of the stories you fall under international pressure or a pressure from other sources. So if Canadian press is telling you this is an important story, you're likely to look at that and go, that is an important story. When I was in the newsroom, back then we had UPI and AP newswires as well. And, stuff starts coming across in the United States and you make a certain determination, and the American information becomes tremendously, here in Canada, unfortunately, it takes on more influence than it should. And so just to talk on one side of it, and I'll answer the other side, I was watching a CBC newscast recently, and they led with a story about an American who was pardoned by the US president and will not have to go to jail. Meanwhile, here in Canada, we had our own government scandal taking place, which in my opinion, had I been on the desk, would have been the top item. Someone there, might have been weekend staff, I don't know what, summer staff, somebody decided that an American businessman going to jail with no connection to Canada would lead. So what I tend to look for is I tend to look for a couple of things. I tend to look for stories that have a national implication. My audience is tuning into me if it's on broadcast television, or if it's on a website, a Canadian-based website, they want to know what's going on here in Canada. But they also want to know an international story, and they want to know it from a perspective that may have some national implication. In some nations, we're not so concerned about our national implication. We're interested in the story for the story's sake. So I'm looking at, when I make a judgment about what goes where, I'm looking at its implication for my audience, my viewers. But by the same token, I'm looking for its long-term implication. So unfortunately, a lot of people in newsrooms now tend to look at what does it mean? Like, are there lots of interested people? And unfortunately, if news was done democratically, then an awful lot of news stories would feature Lady Gaga or Nicki Minaj or Beyonce. And they may be important, but they aren't bread and butter. I mean, the kinds of issues I'm looking at are international security, economic benefits, health, obviously, right now. These are items I'm looking at. So entertainment and sports are important, but they're over there to the side.
Yeah.
I'm looking to make judgments based upon what impacts the lives of the people who are watching and what information they need to know. As you know, part of a healthy democracy, part of a healthy public is the ability to have that information you need when it comes time to vote, when it comes time to have an influence on public matters of public importance. People need to have that information. So we in the media, I think it's our responsibility to make sure, before you hear the lyrics to Nicki Minaj's new song, you need to know what legislation your government is passing or is being introduced around the world.
Yeah. And, just a second leg to that question is, Canada being largely an immigrant community, a lot of people are coming in right now into Canada, do you think the Canadian press is reporting that part as much as he ought to about the immigrant community?
There's room for improvement. they make an effort. I see the effort. You know, when there's an earthquake, for example, there's a bad earthquake in Pakistan, there's a large Pakistani population living in Canada. And I noticed that our media were very quick to cover it. That sort of thing is very important. If a typhoon hits the Philippines, as Haiyan, I think it was Haiyan did, because it's a large expatriate Filipino community here in Canada, the media does cover these stories. Those are international stories. Now, the lives inside those communities in Canada and prevailing opinions in those communities, we don't see a whole lot of, because often enough, we don't know how to reach the various communities, and the various communities may not be equipped, and we can talk about that, may not be equipped to communicate that kind of information themselves. Let me expand upon that, may I?
Yeah, sure, please.
In many communities, particularly new Canadian communities, we've discovered years ago as a producer, when I wanted to get people to come on and produce programs of minority languages, minority cultures, we had trouble finding people. And in many communities, we discovered that the pressure on young people, the second and third generations, was to go into professions like medicine, law, engineering, sciences. So we had, at that point, not anymore, but at that point, we had a dearth of people who came from other communities and could understand them and communicate from them. So we need to redouble our efforts to make sure people come forward from other communities. So if a hurricane hits Mozambique, which it did, as you know, and Tanzania a couple of years ago, that we have somebody in the newsroom who's connected to the story personally, or knows people, or can access people who here can talk about what the implication is. And that happens when a community becomes, when it's young people become fully integrated in the educational life, as I said.
Yeah. Okay, let me not preempt myself. Let me take it sequentially. So,
I may have jumped ahead here. Sorry.
Yeah, because as you're answering that question, another issue popped out in my head, and I don't want to jump into it. We'll get there in a moment. Yeah. So in your view, Richard, how would you describe how Africa has been reported on mainstream media, especially in the West? You know, talking about petrol stories, poverty, wars, corruption, and all.
Africa, you mean the basket case of the world? Mm-hmm. I say this facetiously. When we hear about Africa, it's Rwanda, it's Somalia that's ungovernable, it's Malian rebels, and often enough we hear such stories, and we don't hear about successful nations or nations that have turned themselves around. We hear more often, and this is typical of most news, if it bleeds, it leads. So, you know, Sierra Leone under Foday Sanko got an awful lot of coverage because of the awful things his so-called government, his administration was doing. When the nation begins to rebuild, we're not there. We're not hearing so much about what's going on in Sierra Leone now. So there has been a tendency to, I mean, the big stories out of Africa as a continent in the last, let's say, decade, there was the blood diamonds, the problem there. There's the Lord's Army in Kenya. There's been, usually unhappy stories. There's what they call the Arab Street in North Africa. You know, so the stories we've been inclined to hear, and in Nigeria, young girls getting kidnapped. They're not stories that indicate to us there's much strength or hope or joy in Africa. Though I have to give BBC credit. I think a lot of BBC has gone out of its way to talk about African business. I saw a piece recently about booming Lagos, what's going on in Nigeria with the economy, etc. But generally speaking, a lot of the coverage has tended to be what's wrong. And it's also, a lot of the stories in Africa are not going to come out of the centers that we tend to cover. We have like a reporter in Cape Town or Johannesburg, and one in Nairobi, and one in Lagos, and maybe one in Cairo. But those may be our bureaus, but where the things may be happening may be elsewhere. And so what we do here is cases where governments are falling apart, where rebels are uprising, where nations are virtually ungovernable. So I think we need to make an effort to say, wait a minute, I'm not talking about telling good news stories. I'm saying there are other stories. The success of microcredit, for example, the success of microcredit is a story well worth telling. The advancement of equality and inclusiveness in South Africa is a story. We told it when it started to emerge in the 1990s. It needs to be retold again. I mean, there are some stories. There's an economic story to be told that we're not getting. And then by the same token, and I'm going to sound like I'm telling you two sides. I remember in the late 1990s and in 2000s, when 450,000 people a year were being murdered in Congo Zaire, DRC, what was then Zaire, the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And we weren't telling that story. But if a handful of people died in Europe, we heard that story.
Yeah.
So I used to, on my television program, I had a program called Behind the Story. We used to comment on the fact that there's 450,000 people just died in DRC. And that should be a massive story. That's enormous. Barely got much mention here. So, I mean, we can talk about the why that happens, but that's some of what, I mean, when you look at a balanced newscast, here's another one for you. Why are we not hearing more about the growing influence of China?
Mm-hmm.
The Belt Road
Initiative. You won't hear that, yeah.
We're not hearing it. The BBC covers it occasionally. I know The Economist talks about it, but we ain't hearing that. And that's
even when they talk about it, it has a tone like, "Oh, Africa, be careful with China." And it's amazing the parallel in that story about the fact that America is largely indebted to China. Every other person does business with China. Yeah. When it comes to Africa, oh, you gotta be careful.
Too stupid to know.
Yeah.
I've seen that kind of story. Yeah.
But how did it? I don't know. How did it get to this place? How did it become? And if you don't have an answer for me, I won't hold you to it. How did it get to this? That only this kind of stories are being told.
I don't know. I will say this, that we have a notion, not just in Africa, wherever we cover the news, that something that's violent gets a lot of coverage. So we hear stories. You remember Jean Bedel Bokassa, who was the quote unquote emperor of the Central African Empire. And there were stories that he had a throne built out of human skulls and all this stuff. We hear that stuff. It's like a horror movie. Everybody goes, "Ooh, we got to hear that." So we get a lot of that kind of coverage. We don't hear about the Kwame Nkrumahs. We hear a lot about the bad leaders.
Yeah.
We hear about Sesi Seko. You know, we hear about the term kleptocrat that was developed for African leaders. We hear about a lot of really bad leaders, but we don't hear about ones who actually been very good. We hear about Charles Taylor? Was that his name in Liberia?
Yeah, in Liberia, yeah.
We hear about him. We should be hearing more about the emergence of someone like Ellen Sirleaf Johnson.
Paul Kagame of recent.
Because here we have a female leader in Africa, which we can talk about that. Yeah. A woman who's showing leadership in Africa, along with Mrs. Michelle. Mm-hmm. Other than that, there aren't a lot of women who've come out of Africa as leaders. So I'd like to hear that story more. I'd like to see more about it. And what is the state of women in Africa? That's a totally underreported story, is the status of women in Africa. And it's not up to us to make the news, but I will say our readership, the people who want to read stuff and want to hear stuff, it's much more interesting to hear about Jean Bedel Bokassa, etc., than it is to hear about someone who's doing a really good job of leading, I guess.
Yeah. You know, even the Boko Haram story, you know, one of the more recent stories, yes. You know, I want to make a particular reference to a woman, this reporter who was formerly with CNN, Aisha Sase, who had written a book and mentioned in a couple of interviews that when she was covering that story, you know, when it was the bad story, CNN was all over it, shipped her down to Borno in Nigeria to cover the story. But when the good news came out about how the girls, a good number of the girls were rescued, they were like, no, that's not a story. And that's one of the reasons why she took a walk.
Whether consciously or not, I would suspect that in many newsrooms and many people who deciding the news, there's a, whether conscious or not, a notion that, oh, you know, Africa, they can't get it right. You know, they just can't get it right. And I can name lots of other nations around the world. Look at Greece's economy. I can name lots of other nations that are ungovernable, and it's not in Africa. But we've tended to see things through a certain lens, a certain way of seeing things. So what happens is the coverage of African stories, I guess it tends to be more coverage when there's more challenge. And so a guy like Mugabe gets lots of coverage, unfortunately, but there are good leaders and we don't hear about them.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
I may be mistaken, but I think of, and maybe he didn't turn out to be a good leader in the long run, but Sékou Touré in Senegal, who was also a poet, I believe, his early leadership at least was worth noting, was worth talking about. And the politics, I find Kenyan politics, believe it or not, with the discussion they had over the constitution and the back and forth, and also because there's a large Muslim contingent within the nation, I find Kenyan stories fascinating, but I'm not the norm. I'm certainly not the norm, but I think, you know, those stories need to be told in a way that people here would pay attention and say, yeah, that makes a difference.
Yeah, even, you know, I was recently reading about a former military ruler in Burkina Faso, Thomas Sankara. Yep. I read about the guy and I wish I knew more about the guy before now, you know. I didn't know a lot about him, but he was obviously like a 21st century leader who ruled in 20th century. All the things that people talk about now are the things he was always talking about.
You know, it's not just news, because culturally, I was driving into work one day and I heard on the radio, I think, correct me if I mispronounce her name, the woman from Mali, is it Fatoumata Diawara? Yeah,
that's correct.
I heard her singing on the radio. I thought, my goodness, that music's beautiful, but it was a college station. You won't hear that on regular radio here, or like King Sunny Ade in West Africa. We need a little more, and Youssou N'Dour, we got exposed to him, but there's also a bit of a lag in terms of, I mean, it's not just the news. We don't know much in North America, in the West, we don't know much about Africa. And given the sheer volume of population and the multiplicity of cultures and languages, you'd think we'd know more.
Sincerely, so, you just preempted my next question, because I was going to say, let's look at the numbers. Yeah. Let's look at numbers. You know, there was a statistics that I read about the fact that Africa's landmass, one, is larger in size than the United States, China, and Brazil all together.
Huge.
Or although, you know, Africa is also more than twice North America in numbers. Or economic factors like top 5 fastest growing economies right now, Rwanda and Eritrea, you know, in Africa. You know, looking at the numbers, what should these numbers do in a newsroom?
I would think, like, okay, you need to, I would say when publishers are interviewing and hiring news directors, I think you need to ask them, what do you know about the world? I think they need to be asked, what's the capital city of Mozambique? I'm not kidding, I'm serious. What was Katanga? What happened in Katanga, you know, back in the early 1960s? I think it behooves our news directors to know this material. As much as we say in Canada, you should know the history of the indigenous peoples that live here, which is, I mean, not a lot of people do, but you should know the history of the indigenous peoples. You should know the histories of the people around the world. And so suddenly we're in a situation where there's news coverage and you don't know anything. Now, and so what happens is if you don't understand the cultural milieu or the economic milieu of a community, then you tend to react to only when it creates a problem. We only notice when a volcano erupts. So the volcano erupts and we're there. Oh, there's Ebola. We're there, right? Or there's intertribal conflict over there. But I think it's important that when we hire people to work in covering news, that we ensure they have a global knowledge. I also think it's up to our schools. I was fortunate. Where I got my schooling, we learned about the world. And I personally take an interest in it. But I would say that if I'm hiring people to cover news, and especially when you live in these communities in North America and Europe now that have become very multicultural. If you're going to cover the Nigerian community in London, England, or in Toronto, you'd better know some Nigerian history. You'd better know more than just Biafra, which everybody here knows. You'd better know more than that. You'd better know about the Hausa people, the Yoruba people. You better know the cultural differences. And I don't think it's been made a point to people that that's really, really important. And the other thing is, given that we're now in an age of international media, you want circulation, you want people to subscribe and read your publication, you'd better project an in-depth understanding of those parts of the world. You'd better show that you know that. And I'm not sure everybody knows how to do that. And I think the demographics, which we can talk about, the way Africa is demographically different than the rest of us, I think you really need to go out of your way to know this stuff. So you don't just show up when a plane crashes in Ethiopia. You understand the Ethiopian milieu, what would happen in search and rescue there. It takes some interest, and it takes also opening bureaus in more than, you have a bureau in Nairobi and one in Lagos and one in Cape Town, let's say. You're going to have reporters and bureaus throughout Africa.
Or at least hire, in diversity, someone who maybe is closer to that region or knows a lot, like you said, about the region,
True.
Yeah.
It's not like I can ask somebody from West Africa to go and cover the Hutu and Tutsi situation and know it any better than maybe I know it. So you do need to understand. There may be also a tendency here to say Africa, well, they're all a certain color, they're all a certain way, not recognizing that there are multiple languages and multiple cultures. It's not one. Yeah. It's not one big melting pot.
When you made mention of the Hutus and the Tutsis right now, I just think that the Rwandan story, for instance, is a story that media is not doing justice to. These are guys who just came out of genocide, and in the space of a couple of years, that entire nation has been transformed.
Absolutely. Do tell. I totally. And we had lost hope that could ever be picked up. And unfortunately, out of the crucible of a horrific blight on humanity, that particular violence was something we will never forget. What's coming out now is just stunning.
It is stunning. Why
is that? I know you're the interviewer, but I have a question. Is it the leadership, or is it the people scared themselves, or what's happened?
It's the leadership. The guy who is in charge now, Paul Kagame, was actually the guy who, it was military, and it took the bulls by the horn and ended the killings. It ended the killing and also detribalized the entire nation, so much so that if you're tribalistic, you go to jail. So many people were jailed who were in opposition, and the guy's making a lot of economic reforms, so much so that Rwanda is the fastest growing economy in Africa right now. And I think is number 5 in the world. And I've seen the guy being attacked instead of people singing his praises. The only thing he gets is being attacked by the Western media. I've seen him travel to New York, and the question is not majorly about, what are you doing? How did you do it? The question is about, people are saying you're still despotic, you're still this, you're still that. And he has to always defend himself.
I've said this elsewhere, and I don't want to be misunderstood. I say this with real sensitivity, that sometimes when you emerge from colonialism, when you first become maître chez nous, as they say in French, masters in your own house, sometimes single-party democracy for a short period of time can be very useful. I'm not a big fan of single-party democracy.
Mugabe, I'm with you, Richard.
Never knew when to go. But
I'm with you on that.
Julius Nyerere, Jomo Kenyatta, Kenneth Kaunda, they were all single-party democracies. Kaunda less so, but they did some tremendous work. Kwame Nkrumah. they did some very good work. Now, it's not meant that you're supposed to have a single party democracy forever.
Yeah.
But when you first emerge from colonialism, it can be the fastest route out and for economic growth.
I agree with you absolutely. It's not just, you know, not even looking outside of Africa, looking at some of the Asian tigers right now. That's what happened. You know, talk about Singapore, talk about Malaysia, even talk about China, even talk about capitalist China.
Singapore, for all intents and purposes, and Japan in many ways, have both been single party. I think the Liberal Democrats have been in power in Japan for all but maybe 6 years since the war. And Lee Kuan Yew's party in Singapore, I think they've just been reelected. They've been in power forever in Singapore. And I mean, I'm not going to talk to political freedoms, but I am going to talk to such basic things as, is there enough food to eat? Is there enough health care? We can talk about political rights once we get everybody fed, get everybody the medical attention, and we get everybody educated. We get those three things in place right away. Then we can start, and this is my approach, people can hate it, but then we can start talking about the other freedoms. But first of all, make sure there's enough food, there's enough health care, there's enough shelter, enough education, the basics. Right. That's what I think.
Yeah. So, Richard, I want to play a video for you of a typical othering of Africa in the Western newsroom. When I've watched this video over and over again to be sure, or am I exaggerating and stuff? So I want to share with you.
Please, go ahead.
I'm Bryant Gumbel of HBO's Real Sports with a profile of Masai Ujiri, the architect of the reigning NBA champion Toronto Raptors, who's changing the landscape of basketball in Africa.
This is Zaria, a remote city in northern Nigeria, cut off from the rest of the world, and maybe the last place on earth where you'd expect to find one of the greatest prizes in sports. But here it was in August, the famed Larry O'Brien Trophy, courtesy of Masai Ujiri.
Okay, Richard, I don't want to play it for too long.
No, I know the story.
Yeah, listen to the first 3 words. They were heavy. A remote part of Nigeria, cut off from the entire world. And you would not expect anything good to come out of it. Why? Why would they use such a big statement? And I'm wondering who did the research. I'm wondering, these reporters, did they even go on Wikipedia to read about the city they're talking about? Moreover, the same subject in the documentary, Masai Ujiri, came out of that place. How is for almost 500,000 people cut off from the entire world? That city they're talking about was the same city that had one of the only African women warriors, the Queen Amina of Zauzau. That same city has Nigeria's largest university. My father graduated from that university. I have no idea what you're thinking about. What do you think?
I think it's there it is. We're just putting everybody in a basket. And unless you come from the major centers, if you're from Nairobi or Lagos, or like I said before, you're from major centers, you got no right being intelligent or being smart, not knowing that the interior trade route of that part of Africa, like Timbuktu, there were places that were tremendous places of learning, right? I mean, there were places up in Mali and Burkina Faso and throughout that part of the Sahel and Africa that were centers of learning. But of course, when you come at it with a perspective that universities started in Europe, learning started in Europe, you carry with you a bias. And you think the further people were from the coast, the stupider they were. And that's what the thinking is. All the smart people must live near the coasts, right? So if you don't live in, Abidjan, or you don't live in Lagos, or you don't live in Dakar, or even Banjul, whatever. I mean, the thing is, you're not smart enough. You're not smart. So there's kind of that thinking, and that it's kind of that heart of darkness. You know this novel by Joseph Conrad? He was a Polish-born Briton, and Heart of Darkness. He goes up the river, and it gets weirder and weirder. The further away he gets from the mouth of the river, he goes up this river. It's and they made the movie Apocalypse Now based on it. There is this notion that the more remote you get from the coast, the more remote you get from the major centers of civilization, the more primitive it is. So that fits the narrative. It's primitive when you go inland.
You know, Richard, when I had this when I watched this video, the first thing that I instinctively did was to pick up my book, this book that you told me to get.
Starbucks, yes.
And I went to read, was it page 13, talking about, you know, what you expect in a story, and it didn't line up. You're a journalist, you're a veteran. Is there any part of this particular report that is journalistic? Because it's not fair, you know, and the principle of fairness is key.
I will tell you what the problem here is. Somebody made the presumption that they could talk for Nigeria. Somebody made the presumption they could talk for Maasai. Somebody should have said to him, we're used to people hearing that people come from Port Harcourt or from Lagos or, you know, or Kano or whatever, or Kaduna, but you don't come from any of those communities. Tell us about your community. Tell us about your community, not we're telling you. Then he could have said, oh, historically, my community was learned and bright and intelligent, a center of learning, unknown to many people. It's a place where the first institutions of higher learning emerged in West Africa. Then we could all hear what he has to say rather than we're going to tell you. Part of being good at this is to know to ask the question, not to assume anything. I didn't assume that he was from some, I mean, I know that there's a tradition in northern Nigeria, and as many of us do, of learning and intelligence, whether it's Islamic rooted or not. There is both forms of learning in there, but people don't know this. And the media, rather than making an assumption, and a reporter should actually ask a question. And rather than saying, well, I know this, he's right in the middle of nowhere. Not exactly, that was a trade route. So it's worth telling the story from that point of view. But there's an assumption that I know. And so very often the story of, I'll tell you, our indigenous people will tell you the same thing. Stop telling my story for me. Let me tell my story because it does make sense. So very quickly, as an aside, a lot of indigenous people, they live in these reserves in northern parts of Canada. And the reserves are places of sometimes abject poverty and destitution, not always, but sometimes. And you know, when you take a nomadic people who always followed their food, they were nomadic, and you say, we, the government, we need to serve you. We need to give you healthcare and hospitals. You need to settle down. We're going to make a settlement. Everybody settle here. Runs counter to their lifestyle. That story needs to be told. Yeah. So the same is true here. What do we know? There's a story to be told about how did this man emerge from that community? Of course, a lot of it is his personal drive, but a lot of it is where he grew up. Yeah. You need to tell both.
So what kind of stories do we need to hear? What stories are we not hearing about Africa?
I can tell you some good stories and I can tell you some not so good stories. I'll start with the good news first. The good news is the advance of African agriculture. There's been in certain parts of Africa tremendous advances in agriculture. I'd like to hear about that. I'd like to hear more about it. There's been advances in education and in peace between groups, like you mentioned in Rwanda, that have historic antipathy. That's a story we need to hear. I want to hear stories about African commerce. I mean, rather than portraying Africa as a basket case, I mean, the microcredit, for example, is just, we've told that story many times, but excuse me, the microcredit is an example of African ingenuity. We don't hear much about that. And then there are other good stories. I want to hear, how did Kenya become so successful with coffee? Mm-hmm. I mean, the story no one's telling me. I hear about Colombian coffee, Kenyan coffee. Who got the idea to train Kenyan marathon runners or Moroccan marathon runners? How that happens? And I also want to hear stories about the Chinese influence in Africa. We're hearing nothing about that. I want to hear more about, you know, when the Chinese government builds a high-speed rail between Mombasa and Nairobi. What does that mean? What are the implications? What are the upsides? So what's the downside? What's the upside? When they go to Djibouti, Afars and Isas, and they build a military base, and then the Chinese now use that base, is that a good story or a bad story? And here's a story that's not going to make me very popular with people. I would like to see more stories reporting about African women. I honestly feel that a good chunk of Africa's future success awaits the equalization, the equality of women in the societies at large. When women emerge in leadership, economic as well as political, both forms of leadership, I think Africa will be well on its way to achieving its destiny, which is, its destiny is magnificent. It will achieve that magnificent destiny when it, first of all, does not allow others to tell it who it is, number one. It has its own identity. I mean, every community has its own identity. And when women emerge in their leadership role, I've seen that nation after nation after nation, that's important. That's why I thought, when I go back to the case of Ellen Sirleaf Johnson, when she emerged as a leader, I thought this is a very good sign. I think we're waiting to see more such signs. I like to see stories like that. I'd also, but rather than me say, it's important to go to the African nations and say, what stories would you like us to tell? I mean, we tell about the Lord's Resistance Army ad nauseum. We tell about the Malian uprising ad nauseum. But are there stories, breakthroughs that are worth telling? Are there things, advances that we need to hear about? Are there areas of need that we need to hear about? Why do, some nations seem to get things right and others not so much? Ghana has had tremendous success in some areas. And I see Ghanaians emerging into the world as wealthy and influential. What are they doing? Tell me, what are they doing? So that's what I'd like to hear.
Yeah. So, I always imagine that I think that maybe one of the problems is that Africa is stuck in its history. And, you've spoken a lot about it, the Fortis uncles,
yes,
the Mugabes, that's history.
Yeah,
that's a generation that almost all of them have passed away. And Africa is stuck there. So what will it take, for different stories other than stories of famine, violence to arise from Africa?
It's going to take probably around the world. Somebody at the BBC is doing some thinking. Somebody at The Economist is doing some thinking and saying, what stories are there coming out of Africa? I'm not saying give me good stories. Not saying we only want to portray Africa as not a good place. Just what stories are emerging. You need that. You also need journalists arising from the African milieu to tell their own story. I don't think people from here need to be going into Africa to tell African stories. I would like to think that the schools are graduating people who are capable of telling the story in such ways that they're intriguing and interesting and have value. And I think it's up to our schools over here to teach our young people that there's value to be gained from other milieus, not only African, Asian, European, South American milieu. I have to tell you, growing up in Canada, we learned nothing about South America's history. We learned a tiny little bit about Africa's history, but we learned nothing about, I saw South America, I saw Simón de Bolívar in a few books, a picture of him. Other than that, I knew virtually nothing about South American history, really. So it's going to take a period where we all have an interest. I hate to say it, but North America has a short attention span. About 30 years ago, everybody was in love with Australia. You couldn't tell enough Australian stories in movies, in the news, Outback Steakhouse, everywhere you went, everything was Australian. We've moved on, but we still find Australia interesting. We need to reach this stage where we kind of fall in love with the African story and we want to hear it. And not just from Isaac Dinesen, not just out of Africa. We want to hear a story, stories, and not Robert Payton with, Cry the Beloved Country. We want to hear African stories told by Africans. So there's a Nigerian author who they study in school here, into the CH. They study him in school here. But I think it's a matter of hearing the stories from the community itself, and the community feeling comfortable enough to tell its stories to the rest of the world. I'd like to hear them.
Yeah, maybe you're talking about Chinua Achebe.
Thank you, Achebe, yes.
Yeah.
My son read his book in school. So it's part of the reading curriculum now here in Ontario, in Canada. But we need more of that, And typically what we got in literature is we got Doris Lessing, a white woman from Rhodesia, which is nothing wrong with that. She's a brilliant author. Don't get me wrong. Mm-hmm. or who wrote under the name Isaac Dinesen as well. I think that's who it was, yes. No, that wasn't her. Isaac Dinesen, a different woman. And Robert Payton.
Yeah.
There are many, many voices we're not hearing, so I'd like to hear them myself. And I guess it's a matter of education within African nations to start looking out to the world and saying the world needs to hear what we have to bring. And that's a matter of confidence. The world needs to hear it. And it's a matter of the developed world saying, hey, there's a story over there we need to hear. There's things to be learned.
Oh, it's been good talking to you, Richard.
It's been really good talking to you too.
Yeah.
And I say this, there's a burden on the West, developed culture in the West, to make, to expand its horizons and include all parts of the world. And there's also the challenge in other parts of the world to say our children need to grow up with an ability to tell our stories and make sure our stories are heard.
Mm.
There's a bit of a burden on both, but certainly at this end, newsrooms and organizations need to say, you know, Nicki Minaj and Lady Gaga can wait till later. You know, we've still got a few minutes left. We should talk about other parts of the world.
Thank you so much, Richard, for speaking with me once again today. And I really enjoyed this conversation.
I do too, thank you.
Yeah. All right, then see you soon.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.